The transcended immediate presence of the self-conscious essence has the form of universal self-consciousness. This notion of the transcended individual self that is absolute being immediately expresses, therefore, the establishing of a community which, tarrying hitherto in the sphere of picture thinking, now returns into itself as the self. And in doing this, spirit passes over from the second element constituting it, that is, from picture thinking, into the third element, self-consciousness, as such. If we further consider the behavior of picture thinking in its progress, we find, first of all, the declaration that the divine being takes on human nature. Here, it is already asserted that in themselves, the two are not separate. Likewise, in the declaration that the divine being from the beginning externalizes itself, that its existence withdraws into itself and becomes self-centered and evil, implies, though it does not expressly assert, that this evil existence is not in itself something alien to the divine being. Absolute being would be but an empty name if in truth there were for it an other, if there were a fall from it. On the contrary, the moment of being within self constitutes the essential moment of the self as spirit. That this being within self and the actuality which follows from it belong to absolute being itself, this which for us is notion, and insofar as it is notion, appears to the picture-thinking consciousness as an incomprehensible happening. The in itself assumes for it the form of indifferent being. The thought that these moments of absolute being and of the self-centered self, which seem to flee from each other, are not separate, also appears in this picture thinking, for it does possess the true content. But this picture thought comes later in the externalization of the divine being who is made flesh. The picture thought is in this way still immediate and therefore not spiritual. It knows the human form of the divine being at first only as a particular, not yet as a universal form. It becomes spiritual for this consciousness in the movement whereby this divine being in human shape sacrifices his immediate existence again and returns to the divine being. Only when essence is reflected into itself is it spirit. In this picture thought, there is depicted the reconciliation of the divine being with its other in general and specifically with the thought of it, evil. If this reconciliation is notionally expressed by saying that it consists in the fact that evil is in itself the same as goodness, or again that the divine being is the same as nature in its whole extent, or that nature separated from the divine being is simply nothing, we must regard this as an unspiritual way of talking and one that is necessarily bound to give rise to misunderstandings. If evil is the same as goodness, then evil is just not evil, nor goodness good. On the contrary, both are suspended moments. Evil in general is self-centered being for self, and goodness is what is simple and without a self. Paragraph 780 is one of the longest in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Indeed, you might say it's overlong for a single paragraph. If you think about what a paragraph typically is, a consistent development of thought. There's so much going on in here over the 2 pages in the Miller translation that it's just not going to all be coverable in the depth that we want to go into in a single installation of this commentary. So we're breaking it into 2 different portions of the same paragraph, with the hinge between them being the place where Hegel says, if evil is the same as goodness, then evil is just not evil, nor goodness good. On the contrary, both are suspended moments. Evil in general is self-centered being for self, and goodness is what is simple and without a self. So we're going to go that far in this one, and then we'll pick up at that point in the next one, and hopefully manage to pack all of this into the normal scope of these commentaries. So that said, what is going on in here? We are coming off of as I mentioned in the previous one, a very metaphysical and abstract but very important hinge paragraph, and now we're getting good and evil coming back up for discussion. But there's an even bigger contrast that is rearing its head very explicitly, and which we're going to see some development taking place within this paragraph 780. And that is the distinction that Hegel makes consistently throughout his works, but very much so in terms of religion and the relation between religion and philosophy or absolute knowledge that we're heading towards. And that is between picture thinking, as it's being translated here. A representation is a broader term that gets used, Vorstellung, right? And this is not a bad thing for Hegel, being represented or pictured or imagined. This is very important, right? But it's not the full development of what Hegel is going to call the notion or concept, the Begriff. And here it's going to be self-consciousness as such that gets associated with it. And there's a lot to say about that. But let's start at the very beginning with the text. He tells us the transcended, that's aufgehoben, immediate presence of the self-conscious essence. Now, presence, Gegenwart, could be also translated as present. There's a temporal dimension to it. The transcendent immediate presence of the self-conscious essence, the Wesen, has the form of universal self-consciousness. So we're seeing self-consciousness is important in this discussion, right? And there's a lot to say about it. But I do want to point out universal self-consciousness. Where do we find universal self-consciousness? I mean, we could say, well, we find it within ourselves. And if you think about the way that people often proceeded in philosophy in the modern period, it was by looking within to themselves, to their own experience. Even the empiricists, like Hume especially, would do this. I am the universal self-consciousness. And this leads us into Kant, and this leads us into other thinkers later on. But maybe we find the universal self-consciousness, the Allgemeine, not just within our own purview, but within something that situates us, exceeds us. A other kind of meine, right? In this case, Gemeinde, the community as it's being translated here. So he says the notion, the concept of the transcended individual self that is absolute being immediately expresses, therefore, what? The establishing of a community. And now notice, establishing, Konstituierung, right? There's a lot of German words that Hegel could have used here. Instead, he uses this rather Latinate technical term that typically refers to institutions, to politics, to the sphere in which people are making deliberate arrangements, establishing things, setting things up. And what is being set up here? A community, a Gemeinde, a religious community, what we've been talking about for such a long time in the religion section, and even before it to some degree, insofar as religion entered in, insofar as the religion has something that is social, which is generally how religion finds itself. It's only really in eccentric people and in modernity that we find religion being this totally individualized matter. But that's a topic for another time. So we're going to come back to the self-consciousness thing, but I do want to go on a little bit with this sentence. Now notice the next thing which he says. The establishing of a community which, tarrying, verweilen, hitherto in the sphere of picture thinking, now returns into itself as the self. And in doing this, spirit, and we'll talk about these elements, so it returns into itself. Before it was tarrying, messing around, trying to hang out and do what it's going to do in the realm of Vorstellung. It is picturing not only itself to itself, but also the religious object, the divine, to it, and its relation to the divine. All these things are being expressed in what we can call picture language, in representation. And this is going to take a number of determinate forms, as we've already seen. For example, the incarnation. Now, going back a little bit, so we've got the self-conscious essence, the universal self-consciousness, right? And why are we talking so much about self-consciousness? And why are we going to be figuring the notion as self-consciousness as such? Why is self-consciousness assuming such an important role? Didn't we leave this behind us a long time ago in the self-consciousness section? Well, remind ourselves that there's two ways early on in the religion section that self-consciousness is going to be thematized as central. One of which is talking about the previous sections. You have consciousness, self-consciousness, reason, and spirit. And these are all more and more concrete, and as we go through the book, more and more complex and lengthy discussions that Hegel figures as threads feeding into religion as a kind of, bringing all of them together like a knot. But even more importantly, consciousness and self-consciousness their relations are being worked out through the religion section. We need to bring these two back together again. And it takes, a lot of different forms, not all of which are successful. So let's go on. He talks about passing over from the second element constituting it, that is picture thinking, this is spirit, into the third element, self-consciousness as such, right? So he doesn't say the concept, the notion, the G.W.F, but self-consciousness as such. Well, what do we know about self-consciousness? By the way, self-consciousness is such als solche, right? So not überhaupt or anything like that. But what do we know about it? Well, self-consciousness exists in relation to other self-consciousnesses. They are looking for recognition, anerkennen. Self-consciousness involves a lack, a desire, a begierde, a hunger for what it is that others can give to it. All of this is important here. All of this is part of the notion, but in a complicated way that's not immediately apparent. So he goes on and he says, if we further consider the behavior of picture thinking in its progress. Now, this is very important. Picture thinking has, in fact, been making some progress, a Fortgang in Hegel's German, right? It is going further. It is going beyond. And it's making progress, you could say, in two different complementary ways. One of which is adequate to what it is that it's trying to, get at, leaving picture thinking behind. The other of which occurs within the scope of picture thinking. So it can make progress by developing better and better Vorstellungen, better and better representations or pictures of things. But it can also attempt to progress by moving beyond itself into this third element, self-consciousness as such, or the notion. And he says, if we consider this, we find, first of all, and here we're going to get to a couple different things that picture thinking is saying about human beings and the divine, and we can see a contrast between what picture thinking can give us and what the notion or self-consciousness trying to work this out in a more abstract and also at the same time developed, transcended way is going to tell us. So he says we find, first of all, the declaration, the divine being takes on human nature. Okay, the incarnation, right? So here we're very clearly talking about the Christian conception, we'll say, so we can avoid the words notion or concept of the incarnation. And how is this going to be made sense of? How is its significance grasped? He says, here it is already asserted that in themselves the two are not separate. Likewise, in the declaration that the divine being from the beginning externalizes itself, that its existence withdraws into itself and becomes self-centered and evil, though it does not expressly assert that this evil existence is not in itself something alien to the divine being. So a good bit of theology going on there. Where is this happening? It's not happening, although you might, in a first read, think that this is happening on the side of picture thinking. Picture thinking starts out with divine being takes on human nature, and a, let's call it transcended viewpoint on this tells us that, among other things, in themselves, the two, human and divine, are not separate. The divine being from the beginning externalizes itself. Its existence withdraws into itself and becomes self-centered and evil, right? Whatever evil is going to mean here. So instead of saying, well, at a given point of time, this baby was born, and there come the Magi and Bethlehem and donkeys and all the creche stuff, and then we lose track of this kid for a while until in one of the Gospels he's left behind and hanging out in his father's house, and then fast forward to his ministry and all of this sort of stuff, and then crucifixion, then resurrection, and boom, community. Well, okay, that's a story, but theologically, you can say, from a Hegelian perspective, that was always going to happen. That's not something that just like, boom, popped into existence because God around, here we're being very anachronistic, around AD 0 or BC 0, of course, because these are referring to Anno Domini, year of the Lord, and before Christ, right? God said, well, these Jewish people are having a rough time. Let me send the Messiah, or something like that. No, that's not what's going on from the side of the concept or the third element, right? He goes on and he says, this evil existence is not itself something alien to the divine being. That's something that picture thinking has a hard time making sense out of. And then he says, absolute being would be but an empty name if in truth there were for it an other, if there were a fall from it. On the contrary, the moment of being within self, in sich sein, constitutes, he says, the essential moment of the self of spirit. So that's a pretty intensified thing. Not just spirit, Geist, but the self of spirit, the Selbst of Geist, right? So being within self is something that we can grasp conceptually, but we can't really represent adequately in terms of picture thinking. And here we might also remind ourselves that later on in the philosophy of religion, Hegel is going to express his concerns about reliance not just upon Vorstellung as imagination or picture thinking, schematic representations, but also what he calls the philosophy of the understanding as opposed to the, conceptual philosophy, right? There's certain ways of doing philosophy which are much more like picture thinking and are not going to be helpful here. So he goes on and he says, that this being within self, in sich sein, right, as opposed to an sich sein, and the actuality, the Wirklichkeit, which follows from it, belong to absolute being itself. This which for us is notion, and insofar as it is notion, when it tries to translate back into picture thinking, what do we get here? He calls it an incomprehensible happening, a Geschehen. It happens at some point in stories or history or something like that. Now, the incomprehensible is very funny here because this is almost like a tautology if you think about it, isn't it? Because it's in the German, it's unbegreifliches, right? Literally unconceptual. And, well, of course it's unconceptual because we're moving from the Begriff back into picture thinking. And we've gotten a much richer, much more dynamic understanding of things, and then we try to put it in picture thinking, and it doesn't really come across well. So he says the in itself assumes the form of indifferent being, the thought that those moments of absolute being, of the self-centered self, which seem to flee from each other, are not separate. This also appears in picture thinking, and here he says something really interesting. For it does possess the true content, the inhalt, but this picture thought comes later in the externalization, Äußerung, of the divine being who is made flesh. The picture thought is in this way still immediate, unmediated, and therefore not spiritual. How so? It knows the human form of the divine being at first only as a particular, not yet as a universal form. So it knows, in this happening, it knows Jesus as the person who's, surrounded by a whole community. He draws to himself in opposition to the established authorities of various sorts. People don't know what to make of him. There's a whole cool story, actually stories, that can be told about him. But it doesn't have universal form yet, he says. It becomes spiritual for this consciousness in the movement whereby the divine being in human shape sacrifices his immediate existence and again returns to the divine being. Only when essence is reflected into itself is its spirit. So what are we saying here? We're supposed to move from a developed but still in some respects rudimentary and primitive understanding of what the significance of this Jesus person in his community is, to something that is transformed, transcended, sublated, aufgehoben into a concept. Now he goes on and he says, in this picture thought, there is depicted, and here we have a second thing a second set of things rather, that we go from representation, picture thinking, into the concept, and we see that we've got more to work with as a result. So what is it in this picture thought? There's depicted the reconciliation, the Versöhnung of what? The divine being with its other. Okay, so it's other in general. It's anderes überhaupt. And let's pause for just a second. Just a little bit earlier, Hegel had pointed out that if you really, really think it through, absolute being would be, as he says, an empty name if in truth there were for it an other. There can't really be an other to absolute being in a genuine sense, because everything has to be an absolute being, doesn't it? It has to be encompassed by it. If there could be, again, he says, a fall from it, as picture thinking depicts, as we've talked about in the previous paragraphs. So coming back to this, in picture thought we have the reconciliation of the divine being with its other in general, and specifically, so we're no longer just in general, we're getting specific, we're getting particular, bestimmt, right? With the thought of it, as we saw in the previous paragraphs, the thought of it, evil, böse, and can this be part of absolute being? It has to be, but how do we picture that to ourselves? Well, here's where it gets really, really interesting. So Hegel goes on and he says, if this reconciliation is notionally expressed, right? Literally, not notionally expressed, als Begriff, as concept. If it's actually going to be, conceptualized, we could say, we say that it consists in the fact that evil is itself the same as goodness. Okay, you might say, well, that's not going to work. You can see, kind of look ahead. You've read the paragraph already. Let's just go with this for a minute. So evil is itself the same as goodness. And what else? The divine being is the same as nature in its whole extent, right? In its ganze Umfang, and how nature is grasped as a totality. And notice we've got these two words, same, dasselbe, right? They're actually the same as each other. There's a kind of identity statement going on there, or at least this is just, this reduces to to this. So we've got evil itself, same as goodness, divine being, same as nature in its full extent. And then what do we have? A third assertion. Nature separated from the divine being is simply nothing. And this is interesting because he actually says it's the nothing, right? Das Nichts, right? He could have just said nichts, right? But he calls it nature separated is the nothing. He doesn't really follow that up, and I don't think that we have to follow that up, but it's an interesting thing to note. Now, you could say, well, that's what we got from moving from picture thinking, which, okay, it's got its problems, but now we're in the notion and we're saying, yeah, evil's just the same as goodness, and the divine is the same as nature, and nature is, nothing without the divine being. And you might be like, well, hey, I don't really want to go there then, because this seems really dry, abstract, and probably unhelpful. It's one of those things where you're like, well, hell, everything's the divine being then. And you notice that there's this elision of value, this erasure that's going on. Evil, it's just the same thing as goodness. Who cares, right? Everything does become arbitrary, indifferent at that point in time. And so notice what he says at the next point. We must regard this as an unspiritual way of talking, and way of talking here is actually, concealing the fact that it's sich auszudrücken, right? So it's a unspiritual way for a person or a mind to express themselves, express their understanding, express their relation, express where they fit in. So this isn't the genuine notion and what it yields. This is how picture thinking maybe grasps it, right? And so he says, we must regard this as an unspiritual way of talking, one necessarily bound, notwendig, to give rise to misunderstandings. And here he's going to then, and we're going to close out by talking about those misunderstandings. If evil is the same as goodness, then evil is just not evil, nor goodness good, right? We've got, again, an erasure of value. Everything is made, to go back to a previous paragraph, gleichgültig, of equal value, of, equal worth. But it's not. Evil, there's something different from goodness in evil. And he says, on the contrary, both of these, and here he's telling us, what evil and good are at this point. Again, he's talked about this before as well. On the contrary, both are suspended moments. Evil in general is self-centered being for self. Goodness is what is simple and without a self. Now, that's not an adequate way of framing it either, especially the goodness part. Goodness is what lacks a self. So, nobody has goodness. Nobody who's a somebody has goodness. Well, that would be a big problem. That is not actually Hegel's position, of course. But what we're seeing here is the attempts to move from picture thinking into the concept are not quite so simple and straightforward as just like flipping a switch or saying, aha, I've got a, aha moment, some sort of immediate enlightenment. No, there's a lot of work involved in making sense of this. And this is a good place for us to stop here in this paragraph and let it sink in before we make yet another big effort to push through the remaining half of paragraph 780.